Picture this. You're standing on a narrow mountain pass, the salty spray of the Aegean Sea hitting your bronze shield. Behind you lies everything you've ever known, your wife, your children, your homeland. In front of you stretches an army so vast it drinks rivers dry and blocks out the sun with its arrows. The odds? 1,000 to 1. The enemy? The most powerful empire the world has ever seen. Your mission? Hold this pass or watch civilization itself burn. This is the story of 300 men who chose to die rather than kneel, and in doing so, changed the course of human history forever. If you're ready to witness the most legendary last stand in human history, hit that like button right now. And don't forget to subscribe because we're diving deep into the battles that shaped our world. And here's what I want to know from you in the comments. If you had to choose between certain death defending your homeland or living as a slave under foreign rule, what would you choose? Drop your answer below because this moral dilemma is exactly what faced every single Spartan warrior on that fateful day. The year was 480 BCE, and the ancient world was about to witness something unprecedented. For decades, the Persian Empire had been expanding like a wildfire across 3 continents. From the scorching deserts of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia to the shores of the Black Sea. One man's ambition had forged the largest empire in human history. That man was Xerxes, King of Kings, ruler of 46 nations, and he had set his sights on the one prize that had eluded his father, Greece. But this wasn't just another conquest. This was personal. 10 years earlier, Xerxes' father Darius had sent an army across the Aegean to punish the Greeks for supporting a rebellion in Persian-controlled Asia Minor. That army had been humiliated at Marathon by a force of Athenians who shouldn't have stood a chance. The Persian dead numbered in the thousands, while the Greeks lost fewer than 200 men. For Darius, it was an embarrassing defeat. For Xerxes, it was an insult that demanded blood. When Darius died and Xerxes ascended to the throne, he inherited not just an empire, but a burning desire for revenge. For 4 years, he prepared. Across the vast expanse of his realm, from India to Ethiopia, the call went out. Every province, every kingdom, every tribe under Persian rule was commanded to contribute soldiers to the greatest army ever assembled. The historian Herodotus, writing decades later, would claim that Xerxes marched with over 2 million men. Modern historians consider this an exaggeration, but even conservative estimates put the Persian force at several 100,000, a number that would have been virtually incomprehensible to the ancient world. This wasn't just an army, it was a moving nation. Engineers built bridges across the Hellespont to carry the massive force from Asia into Europe. Supply ships shadowed the coast, carrying enough food and water to sustain this enormous host. The Persians brought cavalry from the steppes, archers from Persia proper, infantry from every corner of their empire. They had war elephants, siege engines, and a navy that outnumbered all the Greek fleets combined. When this juggernaut began its march south through Thrace and Macedonia, the very earth trembled beneath its feet. Meanwhile, in Greece, panic was setting in. The Greek city-states, perpetually at war with each other, suddenly faced annihilation at the hands of a common enemy. Messengers raced from city to city, carrying news of the Persian advance. The reports were terrifying. Whole populations fleeing before the advancing horde, cities surrendering without resistance, the sky darkened by Persian arrows. Many Greek cities immediately submitted, offering the traditional tokens of earth and water to signify their surrender to the great king. But not all Greeks were willing to bow. In Athens, the great statesman Themistocles had been preparing for this moment for years, building a fleet and fortifying the city. In Sparta, the warrior king Leonidas received the Persian ultimatum with characteristic brevity. When Xerxes' messenger demanded earth and water, the Spartans reportedly threw him into a well, declaring that he could find both at the bottom. This act of defiance set the stage for one of history's most incredible confrontations. The Greeks, despite their numerical disadvantage, had one crucial advantage: geography. Greece's mountainous terrain meant that the massive Persian army could only advance along certain routes. The most direct path south led through a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, literally the hot gates, named for the sulfur springs that bubbled up from the earth nearby. This pass, wedged between towering cliffs and the sea, was barely wide enough for a cart to travel. It was here that the Greeks decided to make their stand. The plan was simple yet audacious: hold Thermopylae long enough for the Greek city-states to unite and prepare their defenses. It was a suicide mission disguised as strategy, and everyone knew it. When the Greek leaders met to decide who would command this desperate defense, all eyes turned to Sparta. Despite making up only a fraction of the Greek population, the Spartans had a reputation that bordered on the mythical. They were warriors from birth to death, raised in a society that valued military excellence above all else. Spartan mothers famously told their sons to come back with your shield or on it, meaning return victorious or die trying. The man chosen to lead this impossible mission was King Leonidas, a warrior in his 60s who had already proven his courage in decades of warfare. Leonidas faced an agonizing decision. Spartan law forbade the king from leaving the city during the religious festival of Carneia, which was currently underway. To march to Thermopylae would require violating sacred tradition, but to stay would mean abandoning Greece to certain destruction. Leonidas chose to march, but the religious restrictions meant he could only take a token force: 300 men from his personal bodyguard, the Hippes. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the elite of Spartan society, chosen not just for their fighting ability, but for their absolute loyalty to the king and state. Each had proven sons to carry on their bloodline, ensuring that their deaths wouldn't end their family lines. As Leonidas and his 300 prepared to leave Sparta, they knew they were marching to their deaths. The oracle at Delphi had already prophesied that either Sparta would fall or its king would die. For the Spartans, this wasn't a source of fear, but of grim satisfaction. They had been raised on stories of glorious death in battle. To die defending Greece against impossible odds was the stuff of legend. The march north took several days, and as they traveled, more Greeks joined them. Thespians, Thebans, and soldiers from other city-states swelled their ranks to around 7,000 men. But everyone understood that the core of the force, the unbreakable center around which the defense would revolve, was Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. When they reached Thermopylae, the Greeks immediately began preparing their positions. The pass was even narrower than expected. At its tightest point, only about 50 feet wide. The ancient Greeks had built a wall across the pass centuries earlier, and the defenders quickly rebuilt and reinforced it. Behind this wall, they would make their stand. The geography of Thermopylae was almost perfectly suited for defense. The narrow pass meant that the Persians couldn't bring their overwhelming numbers to bear. They would have to attack in small groups, negating their numerical advantage. The sea protected one flank, while steep cliffs guarded the other. There was, however, one weakness: a mountain path that wound around the pass, potentially allowing attackers to get behind the Greek position. Leonidas stationed a force of Phocian Greeks to guard this path, but it remained the defense's most vulnerable point. When Xerxes and his vast army arrived at Thermopylae, the sight must have been awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Persian camp stretched for miles, filled with soldiers speaking dozens of languages, wearing the armor and carrying the weapons of distant lands. Supply trains, siege equipment, and herds of animals extended as far as the eye could see. The sound of this enormous host, the clatter of weapons, the neighing of horses, the babble of foreign tongues, would have been audible for miles. Xerxes himself was no ordinary king. Raised from birth to rule the world, he commanded absolute obedience from millions of subjects. His word was law across 3 continents. When he spoke, generals and governors who ruled vast territories trembled. The idea that a handful of Greeks would dare oppose him was almost incomprehensible. When Xerxes first saw the Greek position, he couldn't believe what his scouts reported. A few thousand men had presumed to block his path. It was almost insulting. He sent messengers to the Greek camp, offering them one final chance to surrender. The terms were generous. They could keep their lives and even serve in his army if they abandoned their hopeless position. Leonidas's response became the stuff of legend. When told that Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun, the Spartan Xerxes reportedly replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." When Xerxes demanded that the Greeks lay down their weapons, Leonidas gave his famous reply, "Molon labe, come and take them." For 4 days, Xerxes waited, convinced that the Greeks would come to their senses and withdraw. He couldn't comprehend that these men had chosen death over submission. But as the hours passed and the Greeks remained stubbornly in position, the Persian king's patience began to wear thin. His vast army was consuming enormous quantities of supplies every day. His schedule was already behind due to storms that had damaged his fleet. He couldn't afford to wait indefinitely for a handful of Greeks to see reason. On the 5th day, Xerxes decided to crush this insignificant obstacle with overwhelming force. He ordered his Median troops, elite soldiers from the heartland of the Persian Empire, to advance and clear the pass. These weren't conscripts or levies, they were professional warriors who had conquered nation after nation. They advanced confident in their superiority, anticipating an easy victory over the ragged band of Greeks. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it. As the Medians approached the rebuilt wall, the Greeks emerged to meet them. The Spartans advanced in perfect formation, their bronze shields locked together in an impenetrable phalanx, their long spears bristling like the quills of a porcupine. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, a bronze-clad line of death moving with mechanical precision. The Medians attacked with conventional tactics that had worked against every other enemy they'd faced. They rushed forward, hoping to overwhelm the Greeks with superior numbers and ferocity. Instead, they crashed against the Spartan phalanx like waves against a cliff. The narrow pass meant only a few dozen Persians could engage at any one time, while the Greek formation allowed them to present a solid wall of shields and spears. The Spartan warriors, trained from childhood in the use of the spear and shield, were in their element. Their bronze-tipped spears, longer than Persian weapons, allowed them to strike while staying safely behind their shields. When a spear broke, they drew their short iron swords and continued fighting. When a man fell, another immediately stepped forward to take his place. The phalanx moved like a single organism, each warrior protecting the man beside him while being protected in turn. The slaughter was horrific. Persian bodies piled up in front of the Greek line while the defenders suffered minimal casualties. The Medians, accustomed to fighting enemies who broke and ran when faced with superior numbers, couldn't understand why these Greeks refused to retreat. They threw themselves against the bronze wall again and again, achieving nothing but their own destruction. After hours of futile assault, the surviving Medians retreated in confusion and dismay. They had lost hundreds of men, while the Greeks remained virtually intact. For soldiers who had conquered most of the known world, this defeat was incomprehensible. Word of the disaster quickly spread through the Persian camp, sowing doubt and fear among troops who had considered themselves invincible. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on a hill overlooking the battlefield, was furious. His elite Medians had been humiliated by a handful of Greeks. This was supposed to be a simple clearing operation, not a major battle. In his rage, he ordered forward his most trusted troops, the Immortals, 10,000 elite Persian guards who formed the core of his army. The Immortals were called by this name because their number never varied. When one fell in battle, he was immediately replaced, maintaining the unit's strength at exactly 10,000 men. They were the best equipped, best trained, and most experienced soldiers in the Persian army. Many had served under Darius and had participated in the conquest of Egypt and the suppression of rebellions across the empire. If anyone could break the Greek line, it would be the Immortals. But the Immortals fared no better than the Medians. The narrow pass negated their numerical advantage just as effectively. The Greek phalanx, now bloodied and confident from their earlier victory, met the Persian elite with even greater ferocity. The bronze wall held firm, and once again, Persian bodies began piling up in front of the Greek position. The fighting was intense beyond description. The clash of bronze on bronze, the screams of the wounded and dying, the acrid smell of blood and sweat filled the narrow pass. The Spartans fought with the efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. These men had trained for this moment their entire lives. Every thrust of their spears, every movement of their shields was perfect, economical, deadly. As the day wore on, the Persians began to understand that they weren't facing ordinary men. These Greeks fought with a discipline and ferocity that defied comprehension. They showed no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. When wounded, they continued fighting until they could no longer stand. When their weapons broke, they fought with their hands. When their shields were damaged, they improvised new ones from Persian equipment. The Immortals, despite their reputation and numbers, could make no headway against the Greek line. The pass was too narrow for their superior numbers to matter, and the Greek formation was simply too strong to break. As evening approached, they too retreated, leaving their dead scattered across the blood-soaked ground. That night, both armies tended their wounds and prepared for the next day's fighting. In the Persian camp, there was confusion and growing concern. How could a few thousand Greeks hold off the largest army in history? Some soldiers began to whisper that the Greeks must be protected by their gods, that this was divine punishment for some unknown transgression. Xerxes spent the night in his tent, raging at his generals and demanding answers. How was it possible that his invincible army had been stopped by such a small force? His advisors had no good explanations. Some suggested waiting for the Greeks to run out of supplies, but Xerxes' own supply situation was becoming critical. Others proposed sending the fleet to land troops behind the Greek position, but the weather remained too rough for amphibious operations. In the Greek camp, the mood was grimly satisfied. They had survived the first day and proven that the Persians could be beaten. But everyone understood that this was only the beginning. Xerxes had countless more troops to throw at them, and eventually sheer attrition would take its toll. They had bought time for Greece, but at a cost that could only be measured in their own blood. Leonidas moved among his men, checking on the wounded and offering encouragement to those who would fight again tomorrow. The Spartan king, despite his 60 years, had fought in the front ranks throughout the day. His bronze armor was dented and stained with blood, both his own and that of his enemies. But his resolve remained unshaken. They had come here to die for Greece, and they were succeeding magnificently. The second day brought more of the same horror. Xerxes sent wave after wave of troops against the Greek position, each assault more desperate than the last. Medes, Persians, Sacae, Indians, soldiers from across the empire hurled themselves against the bronze wall of the phalanx. The result was always the same: Persian bodies piling up while the Greek line held firm. The Spartans developed a terrifying tactic during these battles. When the Persians pressed too close, the phalanx would suddenly give ground, appearing to retreat. The Persians, thinking they had finally broken through, would surge forward in disorganized pursuit. Then the Spartans would turn and charge, catching their enemies out of formation and slaughtering them wholesale. This feigned retreat required incredible discipline and coordination, skills that only the Spartans possessed. By the end of the second day, Persian morale was cracking. These were soldiers who had conquered cities and kingdoms, who had never met an enemy they couldn't defeat. Now they faced an enemy that seemed invincible, men who fought like demons and refused to die. Some Persian units began to show reluctance when ordered to attack the pass. The whispers about divine protection grew louder. Xerxes was in a rage that bordered on madness. His reputation, his empire, his very legitimacy as the king of kings was at stake. If word spread that the mighty Persian army had been stopped by 300 Spartans, rebellions would break out across his empire. Subject peoples would begin to believe that the Persians could be defeated. He had to break through at Thermopylae, no matter the cost. But as the third day dawned, it became clear that frontal assault would never work. The pass was simply too narrow, the Greek formation too strong. Then, just as despair was beginning to set in among the Persian leadership, salvation appeared in the form of a Greek traitor named Ephialtes. Ephialtes was a local man who knew the mountains around Thermopylae intimately. Driven by greed for Persian gold, or perhaps resentment against his fellow Greeks, he approached Xerxes with vital information. There was indeed a mountain path that wound around the pass, he revealed. It was narrow and treacherous, but passable for infantry. A force following this path could emerge behind the Greek position, trapping the defenders between two armies. Xerxes seized on this information with desperate enthusiasm. He immediately ordered Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, to take a strong force and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path. They would march through the night and attack the Greeks from behind at dawn. Meanwhile, the main Persian army would launch another frontal assault, catching the Greeks in a deadly pincer movement. The plan was simple but effective. Leonidas had posted 1,000 Phocian Greeks to guard the mountain path, but they were not Spartans. When Hydarnes and his Immortals emerged from the pre-dawn darkness, the Phocians were caught completely off guard. Some accounts suggest they fled without fighting. Others claim they fought briefly before being overwhelmed. Either way, the path was now in Persian hands. As dawn broke on the third day, a runner brought the devastating news to Leonidas. The mountain path had been taken. Persian forces were even now moving to surround the Greek position. The trap was closing, and there was no escape. This was the moment when Leonidas showed why he was worthy to be called a king of Sparta. Faced with the choice between retreat and certain death, he chose death. But he was not willing to sacrifice all the Greeks under his command for his own glory. He ordered the allied forces, Thespians, Thebans, and others, to withdraw while they still could. Most obeyed, but 700 Thespians chose to stay and die with the Spartans. It was one of the most heroic decisions in military history. As the non-Spartan forces began their withdrawal, Leonidas and his 300 prepared for their final battle. They knew that Persian troops were approaching from behind, while the main army prepared another frontal assault. They were about to be caught between two fires with no hope of survival. But instead of despair, the Spartans felt a strange kind of joy. This was the moment they had trained for their entire lives, the chance to die gloriously in defense of their homeland. The final battle began when the Persians attacked from both directions simultaneously. The Spartans, caught between two armies, fought with superhuman fury. They abandoned their defensive position behind the wall and charged into the Persian ranks, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Their bronze spears flashed in the morning sun as they carved through the enemy ranks like reapers in a wheat field. Leonidas himself led the charge, his distinctive royal armor making him a target for every Persian archer and spearman. He fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemies with mechanical precision while inspiring his warriors through his own example. Around him, his 300 fought their final battle with a ferocity that awed even their enemies. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. With attacks coming from multiple directions, the perfect Spartan phalanx formation was impossible to maintain. Instead, the battle broke down into dozens of individual combats, each Spartan warrior surrounded by enemies but continuing to fight with lethal skill. They fought with spears until the shafts broke, then with swords until the blades shattered, then with their bare hands and teeth. One by one, the Spartans fell. But each death was bought with Persian blood, and the enemies began to realize they were fighting men who had transcended normal human limitations. These Greeks fought not just with weapons, but with the fury of men who had chosen death over dishonor. Warriors who had been shaped by one of history's most ruthless military societies. King Leonidas fell in the thick of the fighting, his body pierced by multiple spears and arrows. But even as he died, his warriors fought on, forming a circle around their fallen king's body and refusing to let the Persians claim it as a trophy. The battle for Leonidas' corpse became a symbol of Spartan determination. Even in death, their king would not be dishonored. As the morning progressed, the circle of Spartan defenders grew smaller and smaller. Their bronze armor was dented and blood-stained, their weapons broken or lost, but still they fought on. Persian arrows fell on them like rain, but the survivors continued to resist, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as shields. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, the last Spartan warrior fell. The pass was silent except for the groans of the wounded and dying. Of the 300 who had marched north with Leonidas, not one remained alive. They had achieved their impossible goal. They had held Thermopylae for 3 days against the largest army in history. But more than that, they had shown the world that Persians could be beaten, that the seemingly invincible empire had limits. The cost to the Persians had been enormous. Herodotus claimed that 20,000 Persian soldiers died at Thermopylae, though modern historians consider this an exaggeration. But even conservative estimates put Persian casualties in the thousands, including many immortals and other elite troops. More importantly, the battle had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility and given the Greeks hope that they could resist the invasion. Xerxes, viewing the battlefield littered with his dead soldiers, was filled with rage at the cost of his victory. In a fit of fury, he ordered Leonidas's body to be crucified and his head displayed on a spike. Unprecedented dishonor for a fallen king. This act of desecration only served to further inspire Greek resistance and demonstrated that even in victory, the Persians had been deeply wounded by their encounter with Spartan courage. But the story of Thermopylae didn't end with the death of the 300. Their sacrifice had bought precious time for the Greek city-states to prepare their defenses. The Athenian fleet, strengthened and ready for battle, would soon meet the Persian navy at Salamis. The combined Greek armies would gather for the final confrontation at Plataea. In both battles, the memory of Leonidas and his 300 would inspire the Greek warriors to fight with unprecedented courage. The battle also had immediate strategic consequences. Xerxes' army, though victorious, had been badly mauled and demoralized. The easy conquest of Greece that the Persian king had envisioned was clearly impossible. The Greeks had shown they would fight to the death rather than submit, and this resistance would characterize the entire campaign. Word of the Spartan sacrifice spread throughout Greece like wildfire. Cities that had been wavering in their allegiance to the Greek cause now rallied to the resistance. The 300 had become martyrs, their deaths transforming them from soldiers into symbols of everything the Greeks valued: courage, honor, and freedom. Poets began composing verses about their heroism, and their names were carved into stone monuments that would inspire future generations. The psychological impact on the Persian army was equally significant. These soldiers, drawn from across the empire, had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of warfare and human nature. They had seen men choose certain death over submission, fight with skills that seemed almost supernatural, and maintain discipline and courage in circumstances that would have broken lesser warriors. Many Persian soldiers would carry these images with them for the rest of their lives, and the memory would haunt them in future battles. Perhaps most importantly, Thermopylae established a template for resistance that would echo throughout history. The idea that a small group of determined defenders could hold off a vastly superior force became a powerful symbol of hope for the oppressed and outnumbered. From the Alamo to Stalingrad, from Rorke's Drift to the Warsaw Ghetto, the example of the 300 would inspire countless acts of heroic resistance. In the immediate aftermath of Thermopylae, the Persian army continued its advance into Greece, but the character of the campaign had changed. What was supposed to be a triumphal march had become a grinding war of attrition. Greek cities that might have submitted without a fight now prepared desperate defenses inspired by the Spartan example. The naval battle of Salamis, fought just a few months after Thermopylae, would prove to be the turning point of the war. The Greek fleet, commanded by Themistocles and fighting in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, would use tactics remarkably similar to those employed by Leonidas. They would use geography to negate Persian numerical superiority and fight with a desperation born of the knowledge that defeat meant the end of Greek civilization. The victory at Salamis was followed by the Battle of Plataea, where a combined Greek army finally defeated the Persian land forces and drove them from European soil. In both battles, Greek warriors fought with a ferocity and determination that traced directly back to the inspiration provided by the 300. The Spartan sacrifice had shown that Persians could be beaten, and this knowledge proved decisive in the final Greek victory. But the impact of Thermopylae extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle became a founding myth of Western civilization, embodying values that would echo through history. The idea that free men fighting for their homeland could defeat the forces of tyranny, no matter how overwhelming, became central to Western political thought. The Spartans themselves, despite their militaristic society and often harsh practices, became symbols of principled resistance to oppression. Their willingness to die rather than submit to foreign rule resonated with later generations who found themselves facing similar choices. During the American Revolution, Continental Army officers would invoke the memory of Thermopylae when rallying their troops against British forces. During World War II, Greek resistance fighters would paint Molon Labe on walls as a symbol of their defiance against Nazi occupation. The battle also highlighted the power of individual choice in the face of overwhelming odds. Each of the 300 had made a personal decision to march to Thermopylae, knowing he would not return. This emphasis on individual moral choice, on the responsibility of each person to stand up for what is right, regardless of the consequences, became a cornerstone of Western ethical thought. Modern historians debate many aspects of the battle: the exact numbers involved, the precise sequence of events, the role of the other Greek forces. Some argue that the story has been romanticized beyond recognition, that the reality was more complex and less heroic than the legend suggests. But even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge the basic facts. A small force of Greeks, led by Spartan warriors, held a strategic pass against a vastly superior Persian army for 3 days, inflicting heavy casualties and buying crucial time for Greek resistance. The archaeological evidence supports the basic outline of the ancient accounts. Excavations at Thermopylae have uncovered numerous arrowheads, spear points, and other artifacts consistent with a major battle. The geography of the pass, though changed by millennia of silt deposition, still shows evidence of the ancient defensive positions. The hot springs that gave the pass its name still bubble up from the earth, a reminder of the men who died fighting beside them over 2 millennia ago. Perhaps most remarkably, the values embodied by the 300 remain relevant in our modern world. In an age of global communication and instant information, their story continues to inspire people facing their own impossible odds. The image of warriors standing firm against overwhelming opposition, choosing death over dishonor, sacrifice over safety, continues to resonate with audiences worldwide. The Battle of Thermopylae was more than just a military engagement. It was a defining moment in the history of human civilization. It demonstrated that courage, discipline, and moral conviction could triumph over raw power and numerical superiority. It showed that free men fighting for their homes and families possessed a strength that no amount of wealth or imperial power could match. In the end, the 300 Spartans achieved something more valuable than victory. They achieved immortality. Their names may be forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but their collective legacy lives on. Every time someone chooses to stand up to a bully, every time a small nation resists the aggression of a larger one, every time free people refuse to bow to tyranny, the spirit of Thermopylae lives again. The hot gates of Thermopylae have long since silted over, and the narrow pass where 300 men made their last stand is now buried beneath accumulated earth. But the memory of their sacrifice continues to burn bright, a flame that will never be extinguished as long as human beings value courage over safety, honor over life, and freedom over submission. In choosing to die as free men rather than live as slaves, Leonidas and his 300 warriors didn't just defend a mountain pass, they defended an idea that would outlive empires and inspire generations yet unborn. The immediate aftermath of Thermopylae saw Xerxes' army continue its march southward, but the king himself was a changed man. The easy conquest he had envisioned had become a nightmare of resistance and bloodshed. His advisors reported that morale among the troops was dangerously low. Soldiers who had once believed themselves invincible now whispered nervously around their campfires, wondering what other impossibilities these Greeks might achieve. The Persian advance toward Athens revealed the true strategic genius of the Spartan sacrifice. The 3 days bought at Thermopylae had allowed Themistocles to complete his preparations for the naval battle that would determine Greece's fate. The Athenian fleet, along with contingents from other Greek cities, had assembled in the narrow straits near Salamis Island. Here, geography would once again favor the defenders, just as it had at the Hot Gates. But the psychological impact of Thermopylae was perhaps even more crucial than the time it had bought. Greek sailors who might have fled at the sight of the vast Persian fleet now stood ready to fight, inspired by the example of men who had chosen death over dishonor. When Themistocles addressed his captains before the battle, he spoke of Leonidas and the 300, reminding them that ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things when fighting for freedom. The Battle of Salamis unfolded like an echo of Thermopylae, but fought on water instead of land. The Persian fleet, massive and seemingly overwhelming, found itself trapped in the narrow straits where its numbers became a disadvantage. Greek triremes, smaller but more maneuverable, darted between the enemy ships like wolves among sheep. The narrow waters became clogged with wreckage and drowning Persian sailors, just as the pass at Thermopylae had been choked with enemy dead. Xerxes watched this disaster unfold from a golden throne erected on a hill overlooking the straits, just as he had watched the carnage at Thermopylae. For the second time in months, he witnessed his seemingly invincible forces being destroyed by Greeks who refused to accept the inevitable. The psychological blow was devastating. This was the great king, ruler of 46 nations, master of the world's largest empire, and he was being humiliated by a collection of quarreling city-states. The victory at Salamis shattered Persian naval power and forced Xerxes to reconsider his entire strategy. With his fleet destroyed, he could no longer guarantee supplies for his massive army. The specter of Thermopylae haunted his calculations. If a handful of Greeks could hold a mountain pass for 3 days, what might they accomplish with a year to prepare their defenses? The king made the fateful decision to return to Asia with most of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with a reduced force to complete the conquest of Greece. This decision, born from the psychological trauma of watching his forces destroyed by men who should have been easily crushed, marked the beginning of the end for Persian ambitions in Europe. Mardonius, despite his reduced numbers, still commanded a formidable army. But he too was haunted by the specter of Spartan courage. When he sent ambassadors to Athens offering favorable terms for surrender, the Athenians' response echoed Leonidas's defiance. They would never submit to foreign rule. The final confrontation came at Plataea in 479 BCE, where a united Greek army met Mardonius's forces in open battle. The Greeks numbered around 100,000 men, the largest army they had ever assembled. At the center of this force stood the Spartans, now fighting not just for their own honor, but to avenge their fallen king and his 300 warriors. The Spartan contingent at Plataea was led by Pausanias, Leonidas's nephew, who carried the weight of his uncle's sacrifice into battle. Before the fighting began, he reminded his warriors of the debt they owed to the 300. Their deaths had not been in vain if the living could complete what they had started: the liberation of Greece from Persian tyranny. When the battle lines formed at Plataea, something remarkable happened. Word spread through the Greek ranks about what the Spartans had achieved at Thermopylae, and soldiers from Athens, Corinth, Megara, and dozens of other cities began to fight with a ferocity that matched their Spartan allies. The spirit of the 300 had infected the entire Greek army, transforming citizen soldiers into warriors willing to die for freedom. The Battle of Plataea was a masterpiece of Greek military coordination. The different city-states, usually at each other's throats, fought as a unified force inspired by a common purpose. When the Persian cavalry charged, Greek phalanxes stood firm, just as they had at Thermopylae. When Mardonius himself led a desperate assault on the Spartan line, he was cut down by a Spartan warrior named Leonidas, who struck the Persian general with a stone to the head. The death of Mardonius broke Persian resistance, and what followed was not a battle, but a rout. The surviving Persian forces fled toward their fortified camp, but the Greeks pursued relentlessly. The camp itself, filled with the wealth of the Persian Empire, was stormed and captured. Thousands of Persian soldiers were killed or captured, while Greek casualties were remarkably light. But perhaps the most significant moment of the battle came when the Greeks discovered Mardonius's tent, filled with gold, silver, and precious artifacts from across the Persian Empire. Instead of fighting over the loot, the Greek commanders ordered it to be divided fairly among all the allied cities. This act of unity, inspired by the example of men who had died for something greater than personal gain, marked a new chapter in Greek relations. The victory at Plataea was complete and decisive, but it was also something more. It was the fulfillment of the promise made by 300 men at a narrow mountain pass. Leonidas and his warriors had died, believing that their sacrifice would inspire others to continue the fight for freedom. At Plataea, that faith was vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. The news of Plataea's victory spread across the Greek world like wildfire, and everywhere the message was the same. The example of Thermopylae had made this triumph possible. Cities that had submitted to Persian rule now rose in rebellion. Greek colonies in Asia Minor, inspired by the knowledge that the homeland had successfully resisted, began their own wars of liberation. But the impact of Thermopylae extended far beyond military victories. The battle had fundamentally changed how Greeks saw themselves and their place in the world. Before the Persian Wars, the Greek city-states had been isolated, inward-looking communities that rarely cooperated. The sacrifice of the 300 had shown them what they could achieve when united by common purpose and shared values. This new sense of Greek identity would have profound consequences for world history. Within decades of Thermopylae, Athens would use its naval supremacy to create an empire that spread Greek culture throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The cultural and intellectual achievements of classical Greece, democracy, philosophy, theatre, scientific inquiry, all flourished in the confident atmosphere created by successful resistance to Persian tyranny. The Spartans themselves became legendary figures throughout the Greek world. Their unique society, with its emphasis on discipline, courage, and service to the state, was both admired and feared by other Greeks. Young men from across Greece would travel to Sparta, hoping to learn the secrets of Spartan military excellence. The sayings and customs of Sparta became part of Greek cultural heritage, preserved in literature and oral tradition. But the Spartans paid a price for their fame. The 300 who died at Thermopylae represented a significant portion of Sparta's warrior elite. In a society where citizenship was limited to a small number of warrior families, these losses could not easily be replaced. Sparta would continue to be the premier military power in Greece for generations, but it would never again possess the overwhelming superiority it had enjoyed before the Persian Wars. The story of Thermopylae also began to evolve in the telling, taking on mythical qualities that sometimes obscured the historical reality. Poets and historians embellished the tale, adding dramatic details and heroic speeches that may or may not have occurred. But these embellishments served a purpose. They kept the memory of the sacrifice alive and ensured that its lessons would be passed down to future generations. One of the most enduring aspects of the Thermopylae legend was its emphasis on the ordinary humanity of extraordinary heroes. The 300 were not demigods or supernatural warriors. They were men with wives and children, fears and hopes, who made a conscious choice to die for something greater than themselves. This accessibility made their example more powerful, not less. If ordinary men could achieve such heights of courage and sacrifice, then perhaps others could follow their example when the time came. The Battle of Thermopylae also established certain principles of military thought that would influence warfare for centuries to come. The effective use of terrain to negate numerical superiority became a standard tactical doctrine. The importance of morale and motivation in military success was clearly demonstrated. Most importantly, the battle showed that defensive positions, properly chosen and stubbornly held, could defeat even the most overwhelming offensive forces. These lessons were not lost on later military commanders. Alexander the Great, who would conquer the Persian Empire just over a century after Thermopylae, studied the battle carefully and incorporated its lessons into his own tactical thinking. Roman generals would use similar defensive tactics when facing barbarian invasions. Medieval commanders would apply the principles of Thermopylae when defending castles and fortified positions. The political implications of Thermopylae were equally significant. The battle demonstrated that free men fighting for their homes and families possessed advantages that no amount of imperial wealth could purchase. This lesson would resonate through history, inspiring resistance movements and independence struggles for millennia to come. During the American Revolution, colonial leaders explicitly compared their struggle to the Greek resistance against Persia. The idea that a small nation could successfully resist a vast empire provided both inspiration and practical guidance for the colonial cause. George Washington, facing the overwhelming might of the British Empire, studied the campaigns of the Persian Wars and drew lessons from both the victories and defeats of the ancient Greeks. The French Revolution also drew inspiration from Thermopylae, with revolutionary leaders comparing their struggle against the monarchies of Europe to the Greek fight for freedom against Persian tyranny. The famous phrase, "liberty or death," echoed the Spartan willingness to die rather than submit to foreign rule. Revolutionary armies, often outnumbered and outgunned, found courage in the example of men who had faced impossible odds and fought anyway. In more recent times, the Battle of Thermopylae has continued to inspire resistance movements around the world. During World War II, Greek resistance fighters adopted Mollen Labe as their motto when fighting against Nazi occupation. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the defense of Stalingrad, countless other examples of desperate resistance against overwhelming odds all drew inspiration from the example set at the Hot Gates. But perhaps the most profound impact of Thermopylae has been its contribution to Western concepts of individual freedom and responsibility. The battle embodied the idea that each person has a moral obligation to resist tyranny, regardless of the personal cost. This principle became central to Western political philosophy and helps explain why the story continues to resonate in democratic societies. The 300 Spartans faced a choice that every generation must confront in one form or another: the choice between safety and principle, between survival and honor, between submission and resistance. Their decision to choose death over dishonor established a moral standard that has challenged and inspired humanity for over 2 millennia. Modern archaeological research has provided new insights into the historical reality of Thermopylae, sometimes confirming and sometimes challenging ancient accounts. Excavations at the battlefield have uncovered weapons, armor fragments, and other artifacts that support the basic outline of the traditional story. Carbon dating and other scientific techniques have helped historians establish more precise timelines and casualty figures. However, archaeologists have also revealed the extent to which the landscape has changed since ancient times. The narrow pass where the battle was fought is now several miles inland due to silt deposition, making it difficult for modern visitors to appreciate the tactical situation faced by the ancient warriors. The hot springs that gave Thermopylae its name still exist, but the coastline and topography are dramatically different. These archaeological findings remind us that while the legend of Thermopylae may contain embellishments and mythical elements, it is grounded in historical reality. Real men did fight and die at this place, making choices that changed the course of world history. The power of their example transcends questions about specific details or exact casualty figures. The story of Thermopylae also raises profound questions about the nature of heroism and sacrifice. What drives ordinary people to make extraordinary choices? How do societies create the conditions that produce such courage? Why do some individuals choose to stand and fight while others flee or submit? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Greece. The Spartan educational system, with its emphasis on discipline, physical training, and service to the state, certainly played a role in producing warriors capable of the ultimate sacrifice. But education alone cannot explain the phenomenon of Thermopylae. Other societies have had rigorous military training without producing equivalent examples of heroic sacrifice. Perhaps the key lies in the intersection of individual character, social values, and historical circumstance. The 300 were products of a society that valued honor above life, but they were also individuals who chose to embrace those values when the ultimate test came. They faced a moment when abstract principles became concrete choices, and they chose to act on their deepest beliefs, regardless of the consequences. This intersection of personal conviction and historical necessity has occurred countless times throughout human history, producing heroes and martyrs whose examples continue to inspire. The soldiers who held the line at Gettysburg, the firefighters who entered the burning towers on September 11th, the protesters who faced tanks in Tiananmen Square, all drew upon the same wellspring of human courage that sustained the 300 at Thermopylae. The enduring appeal of the Thermopylae story also reflects humanity's need for examples of moral clarity in an often ambiguous world. The 300 faced a choice that was stark and unambiguous: fight and die, or surrender and live as subjects of a foreign power. There was no middle ground, no room for compromise or rationalization. In a world where moral choices are often complex and unclear, the simplicity of their decision provides a kind of ethical anchor. This moral clarity is perhaps why the story continues to be retold in every generation, adapted to new media and new contexts, but always preserving its essential message. From ancient Greek poetry to modern Hollywood films, from Renaissance paintings to contemporary novels, the tale of Thermopylae has been reimagined countless times, each version reflecting the values and concerns of its own era while preserving the timeless themes of courage, sacrifice, and resistance to tyranny. The Battle of Thermopylae stands as one of history's most powerful demonstrations of the principle that might does not make right, that numerical superiority and material wealth cannot overcome the human spirit when it is properly motivated. In an age when we are often told that resistance is futile, that individuals cannot make a difference against vast systems of power, the example of the 300 reminds us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they choose to act on their deepest convictions. So the next time you face impossible odds, when the world seems aligned against you and victory appears hopeless, Remember the 300. Remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from refusing to surrender. Remember that a few good people, standing together for what they believe in, can change the course of history. And remember that the measure of a person is not how they act when success is certain, but how they stand when defeat seems inevitable. That's the true lesson of Thermopylae, and it's why we still tell this story 25 centuries later. Because heroes aren't born, they're made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things.